California is standing on the edge of a supply chain disruption that could make the pandemic-era shortages look like a warm-up act. And this time, it isn't being driven by a virus, a port shutdown, or a labor strike. It's being driven by policy. Specifically, by a collision between the governor's regulatory agenda and the economic reality of running a grocery distribution network at scale. One of the largest supermarket operators in the United States just blinked. Kroger is in the process of shutting down major distribution centers across California, and the consequences are spreading faster than Sacramento can control the narrative. What's happening right now is being framed publicly as a routine corporate restructuring. Privately, it's something very different. It's a warning sign not just for California, but for every state watching what happens when aggressive regulation collides with thin-margin industries. I'm Elizabeth, and on this channel, we don't wait for the polished press release version of the truth. We follow the money, we track the timeline, and we ask the questions that make powerful people uncomfortable. If that matters to you, subscribe, hit like, and stay with me through this story because the details matter. And before we go any further, I want you involved. Drop a comment telling me how much you're paying for groceries where you live. Real numbers, milk, eggs, meat, whatever stands out to you. Because what's unfolding in California right now has implications that stretch far beyond state borders, and we need to document this in real time before the story gets cleaned up and repackaged. Here's the core of the issue, stripped of political language and talking points. California recently imposed one of the most aggressive warehouse worker mandates in the nation. The law requires large distribution facilities to operate in climate-controlled environments, undergo extensive ergonomic redesigns, and implement quota transparency systems, all under strict compliance deadlines. Miss those deadlines and companies face daily fines that quickly climb into the tens of thousands of dollars per facility. On paper, the goals sound admirable: worker safety, dignity, environmental responsibility. Few people would argue against those principles, but principles don't run logistics networks, math does. And when the math stops working, businesses don't negotiate with ideology, they adapt. Kroger ran the numbers. The company operates multiple large distribution centers across California, several of which were built decades ago, long before modern climate control standards were even imagined. Retrofitting those buildings wasn't a matter of small upgrades. It meant gutting core infrastructure, re-engineering workflows, installing industrial-scale HVAC systems capable of cooling massive concrete facilities, and reducing operational density, all while trying to keep food moving to hundreds of stores. The cost estimates were staggering, the timelines were unrealistic, and the compliance deadlines were non-negotiable. So Kroger faced a choice that every executive team eventually confronts when regulation breaks a business model. Spend hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild aging facilities under impossible timelines, or rethink the entire distribution footprint. The spreadsheet made that decision brutally clear. Rather than pouring capital into California warehouses that might never regain profitability, Kroger began evaluating alternatives: consolidation, out-of-state distribution, longer truck routes paired with lower regulatory costs, lower taxes, and greater operational flexibility. It wasn't an ideological decision, it was arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care about political narratives. Now the fallout is real. Workers are being notified of closures. Store managers are quietly being told to expect supply disruptions during the transition. Executives are bracing for public backlash, while the governor's office races to frame the story as corporate greed rather than policy consequence. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This isn't a morality play. It's not heroes versus villains. It's a case study in what happens when legislation is written without fully accounting for the economic systems it governs. Grocery distribution is a razor-thin margin business. We're talking low single-digit profits on a good day. When costs spike suddenly and dramatically, there is no cushion. There is no room to absorb losses indefinitely. Something has to give, and when something gives, it's rarely the politicians who wrote the law. What makes this moment especially important is that California doesn't operate in isolation. It functions as a policy laboratory. What's tested here often spreads nationwide within a few years. Other states are watching closely. So are corporate boards, CFOs, and logistics planners across the country. If this story ends with facilities closing, workers displaced, shelves disrupted, and communities scrambling, that outcome will shape decisions far beyond California's borders. This is not the end of the story, it's the beginning. In the next part, we're going to walk through the timeline, the law itself, and the financial math that turned a well-intentioned mandate into an exit strategy. Because once you see the numbers laid out clearly, the outcome stops looking mysterious and starts looking inevitable. 3 years before the first warehouse doors began closing, California lawmakers passed what they described as a landmark piece of labor legislation. Assembly Bill 2183, formally titled the Warehouse Worker Protection and Dignity Act, was introduced as a corrective measure for an industry long criticized for intense productivity quotas, physically demanding conditions, and high injury rates. The language of the bill was careful, compassionate, and politically powerful. It promised safer workplaces, greater transparency, and dignity for workers who move the goods that keep the economy running. But buried beneath the aspirational language was a compliance structure that fundamentally altered the economics of warehouse operations. The law applied to distribution facilities exceeding 200,000 square feet, a threshold that captured nearly every major grocery and retail distribution center in the state. It required temperature-controlled working environments regardless of climate zone, mandatory ergonomic assessments for every workstation, disclosure of productivity metrics to workers, and strict limits on how those metrics could be enforced. On top of that, it imposed daily fines starting at $50,000 per facility for noncompliance after a fixed deadline. That deadline was January 1st of this year. What made the mandate uniquely disruptive wasn't any single requirement. It was the combination of cost, scale, and time. Retrofitting an aging warehouse is not like renovating an office building. These facilities are industrial ecosystems. Racking systems, conveyor lines, electrical grids, refrigeration zones, loading docks, and traffic flow are all interconnected. Changing one component forces changes across the entire operation. Kroger operates 7 major distribution centers in California. 4 of them were constructed in the 1980s, when open-air loading docks, minimal insulation, and localized cooling were standard. Bringing those buildings into full compliance with OB 2183 meant far more than installing air conditioning. It required tearing out and reconfiguring racking systems, upgrading electrical capacity to handle industrial HVAC loads, installing miles of ducting, redesigning workflows to meet ergonomic spacing requirements, and reducing operational density per square foot. Engineering firms hired to assess the upgrades produced estimates that landed squarely in the hundreds of millions. Fully retrofitting all 7 facilities was projected to cost approximately $460 million, and that figure assumed no major delays, no supply shortages, and no unexpected construction overruns. The timeline made the situation even worse. Completing that level of retrofit work without shutting down operations would realistically take between 18 and 24 months. Final regulatory guidance clarifying enforcement standards arrived with only 11 months remaining before the compliance deadline. That mismatch mattered, because grocery distribution does not pause. Food moves daily. Disruptions ripple outward immediately. Shutting down a distribution center, even temporarily, can destabilize hundreds of stores within days. There was no realistic way to rebuild the facilities, stay operational, and meet the deadline. Then came the financial reality that Sacramento never fully confronted. Grocery distribution margins typically range from 1.8% to 3.2%, depending on product mix, fuel costs, and labor conditions. These margins are not negotiable. They reflect the economics of moving high-volume, low-margin goods in a competitive market. Financing a $460 million retrofit over 10 years at prevailing interest rates added roughly $43 million per year in debt service. Spread across California operations, that translated into an additional cost per case shipped that wiped out profitability on large portions of the product mix. In simple terms, Kroger would have been losing money every time certain categories moved through those warehouses. At that point, the question shifted from how do we comply to should we continue operating here at all. Kroger commissioned a logistics optimization study, a standard step when fixed costs threaten a business model. Consultants modeled multiple scenarios: partial retrofits, extended timelines, selective compliance. None of them restored profitability under the law's constraints. Then they modeled something else. What if California distribution were consolidated into fewer, newer facilities in neighboring states? Nevada and Arizona offered lower land costs, fewer regulatory mandates, lower workers' compensation premiums, and more flexible zoning. Yes, truck hauls into California would be longer. But the cost of those additional miles was still less than the compliance burden imposed by OB 2183. The models showed break-even in year 3. By year 5, the out-of-state option was financially superior, even accounting for fuel, labor, and logistics complexity. The decision wasn't ideological, it wasn't political, it was mechanical. By March, Kroger's executive leadership approved an internal consolidation plan. 4 California distribution centers would close. Operations would shift to expanded facilities outside the state. The remaining California centers would operate under leaner models with reduced headcount. The math was unavoidable. The law didn't just raise costs, it broke the operating model. And once that happened, the exit was no longer a threat. It was a rational response. In the next part, we're going to look at what happened after that decision became reality. The layoffs, the store-level disruptions, the impact on independent grocers, and the unintended consequences that followed. Because the real cost of this policy didn't show up in a spreadsheet, it showed up in communities. The moment Kroger's consolidation plan moved from internal spreadsheets to real-world execution, the consequences spread fast and unevenly. 4 major California distribution centers began winding down operations. Workers were called into meetings, notices were issued, timelines were set. In total, more than 2,100 California-based logistics jobs were eliminated. Fewer than half that number were created in the new out-of-state facilities. The gap wasn't accidental. It reflected the efficiency gains that made the consolidation financially viable in the first place. The governor's office responded within hours of the public announcement. The statement accused Kroger of abandoning California workers to protect profits and framed the closures as a pressure tactic designed to weaken labor protections. There were promises of investigations, talk of potential penalties, and vague references to legislative remedies. What the statement did not acknowledge was that the economic impact of OB 2183 had been raised repeatedly during the public comment period and dismissed as fearmongering. The policy had been built on an assumption that companies would absorb the costs and stay. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Inside Kroger, the tone was very different. Store managers across California received internal memos outlining a 90-day transition period. During that window, distribution from the closing centers would be gradually rerouted. The memos included a warning that every grocery manager dreads: expect out-of-stocks in high-velocity categories. Dairy, frozen foods, and fresh produce, items that rely on rapid replenishment, were most at risk. Out-of-stocks aren't just an inconvenience, they trigger cascading effects. Customers shop elsewhere, sales per square foot decline, stores are flagged as underperforming, and once that happens, corporate begins asking whether certain locations are still viable. A disruption that starts in a warehouse doesn't stay there, it moves down the chain. The impact extended beyond Kroger-owned stores. Several of the closing distribution centers also supplied independent grocers under wholesale contracts. These were small, often family-run stores serving working-class neighborhoods. When the warehouses shut down, those grocers were forced to scramble for alternative suppliers. Many found that remaining distributors were already operating near capacity or charging significantly higher rates. Some stores adapted by reducing product variety. Others raised prices. A few couldn't make the numbers work at all and closed their doors. In multiple Southern California communities, neighborhoods already classified as food deserts lost their only nearby full-service grocery stores within weeks of the announcement. For residents without reliable transportation, that wasn't an inconvenience. It was a crisis. Then there were the workers. Take Marcela Ruiz. She spent 7 years working overnight shifts in a Kroger distribution center, pulling orders in refrigerated zones that stayed just above freezing. The work was physically demanding, but it paid $23 an hour with benefits. It supported her 2 children and covered a modest apartment rent. When the facility closed, she was offered a transfer to another center nearly 50 miles away. The commute would have added more than 2 hours to her workday and hundreds of dollars a month in fuel costs. Even with the same hourly wage, the math didn't work. She declined and joined the ranks of the unemployed. OB 2183 was written to protect workers like Marcela. Instead, it erased her job. The irony deepened as operations stabilized in the new out-of-state facilities. To justify the capital investment, those megacenters run at higher throughput and rely on demand flex scheduling. Shifts can be added or canceled on short notice based on order volume. Workers report less predictability and more pressure, the opposite of the stability the law claimed to promote. The ripple effects didn't stop there. Cities that lost distribution centers also lost a significant portion of their tax base. Property taxes, business taxes, and ancillary economic activity vanished almost overnight. These were not wealthy municipalities with budget surpluses. They were working-class communities already struggling to fund basic services. As revenue declined, cities cut back, library hours shrank, park maintenance slowed, infrastructure repairs were delayed. The social costs accumulated quietly, far from the headlines. There was also an environmental consequence that contradicted the law's stated goals. Consolidating distribution into Nevada and Arizona increased average trucking distances dramatically. More miles meant more fuel consumption and higher emissions. Internal modeling acknowledged this increase, but it was never highlighted publicly. The political narrative required the law to be framed as a win for environmental justice, even as the supply chain became objectively less efficient. By the time a state analyst's report quietly acknowledged that OB 2183 had led to unintended supply chain modifications, the damage was already done. The report noted thousands of direct and indirect job losses and far fewer compliance-related jobs than projected. The legislative working group tasked with exploring anti-offshoring measures met briefly and then dissolved. The legal reality was unavoidable. States cannot constitutionally prevent companies from moving operations elsewhere. The story faded from the news cycle, but its effects did not. They settled into communities, paychecks, grocery bills, and empty buildings. This is the part that matters most. The law did exactly what the math said it would do. It raised costs beyond what the business model could support. Kroger adapted. Workers, small retailers, and cities absorbed the consequences. The politicians who wrote the law remain in office. The people caught in the middle are still paying the price. And that's the question we're left with. When does a policy designed to protect workers become responsible for destroying their livelihoods? Where does accountability actually land? Because unless that question is answered honestly, this won't be the last time a well-intentioned mandate produces the opposite result.